I'd probably say any time, Dimitra.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Dimitra Fotopoulos, and I'm the Director of Professional and Continuing Education in the Faculty of Continuing Education at Mount Royal University. And we're all here this morning for a session on leading through COVID-19 and beyond. I'd like to start today's event by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Îyârhe Nakoda. We are situated on land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. The traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation. This morning, we will hear from Brad Mahan, Dean, Faculty of Continuing Education, before our panelists begin their presentation. Our first panelist is Todd Hirsch, Vice President and Chief Economist with ATB Financial, who will provide an overview of the local economic picture. Next, Steve Eichler, Partner and Executive Committee Member with Field Law, will speak on the practicalities of law related to COVID-19. Then Steve Armstrong, author, speaker, instructor, and leadership expert, will tackle leading through COVID-19 and beyond. A few housekeeping items. The session this morning is being recorded. And then the next piece is, if you have a question for a panelist, please use the chat box feature during their presentation. I'll be moderating the session, so you can address your question to everyone or to me to ensure that I can see it. Each speaker will address questions following their talk as time allows. We also recommend that you place your screens in speaker mode to best see the speakers. Finally, we'll also open things up for a Q&A session after the presentation to end out today's event. Now, Brad Mahan, Dean of the Faculty of Continuing Education at Mount Royal University, will say a few words. Brad, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Dimitra, and thanks to everybody for joining us today, and including our panelists. Welcome. Having these experts share their perspectives and knowledge is so valuable, especially in this period of continual change. At Mount Royal, we pride ourselves in providing relevant, practical, professional development opportunities that meet the needs of our community. From our new tech-focused certificates like UX design, digital marketing, and cybersecurity, to programs that advance essential business skills like conflict resolution, leadership development, and change management. And we're continually changing too. Do you like what I did there? For example, we've just announced that we're partnering with Calgary Economic Development for Edge Up 2.0, the next phase of a short-term skills development program for displaced mid-career oil and gas professionals. In Alberta, we know that our greatest resource is our people. If there's one thing the pandemic has shown us, it's that we must work together to make progress. Today's event is an example of the community of support that we've fostered over this past extraordinary year. No doubt there will be some valuable, practical information presented here today, and I hope it serves you all well. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Todd Hirsch. As Vice President and Chief Economist with ATB Financial, Todd has his finger on the economic pulse of the province. His latest book, Spiders in COVID Space, Adapting During and After the Pandemic, was just released in March of 2021. I'm particularly interested in hearing his thoughts on what the future might hold for our province. So Todd, good morning, sir. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Brad, and good morning, Mount Royal University. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this exciting panel this morning. It's always a privilege to be able to speak anywhere, but especially to my friends and colleagues at Mount Royal University. Wonderful to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. I said I'd become a self-proclaimed expert at doing this lately with all these webinars. Brad or someone, you want to just give me a verbal okay that you can see the big purple screen?
Looks good, Todd. Looks very good.
Great. The title of my talk this morning, 5 Economic Truths to Unlearn, Alberta's Economy Post-Pandemic. I always love starting with a good quote. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Mark Twain, the American literary giant, is often attributed to having said this. But in a weird twist, in fact, it kind of gets to the heart of what this quote is about. We actually don't know if Mark Twain said this or not. He gets attributed to having said it, but there's no record of him saying it. He never included it in any of his written literature. It just sounds like something Mark Twain would say. And maybe he did, but we don't know for sure. It's an example of one of those things that, if it gets repeated often enough, we take it as truth. That, in fact, Mark Twain said this, but it may not be the case. So we have to ask ourselves, what are some of those things that we know for sure that aren't true? So I want to explore this idea in the realm of economics. And maybe because I've studied and practiced economics for the better part of the last 30 years or more, I feel like I'm busy unlearning a lot of the economic truths, and I'm using air quotes, that I would have picked up over the last 30 years. And it's not that those truths were wrong necessarily. It may just be the case that they are no longer true, or maybe they're no longer fully true. And in fact, we have to unlearn some of these hard truths and take a more nuanced view of them. So what I want to do this morning is walk you through 5 of my favorite economic truths that I am unlearning. I'll talk about them in the context of Alberta particularly. And then at the end, I'll conclude with our latest Alberta economic outlook, my economics team at ATB Financial, and a snapshot of where we see the province this year and going into 2022. So let's start then with the top 5 economic truths to unlearn. Number 1, growing the GDP is always good. Now, this is a trap economists and policymakers and politicians, I dare say, we fall into this all the time because we like the idea of a faster growing GDP. Faster is always better. And I admit, I always like it when I can raise my forecast for GDP growth. People seem to like that. It seems to suggest good news that, in fact, we're going to have faster rate of economic growth. But is that always good? Is it always the case that faster is better? A book that has been quite impactful on me this spring, Mark Carney's Values Building a Better World for All. And by the way, if any of you are looking for a good COVID lockdown reading or maybe a good summertime read, I'd recommend this book. Now, it comes with a warning. It is a slog of a book. It is over 500 pages long. The good news is you'll look really smart, sitting on a lawn chair reading a big tome like this. But you don't be thrown off by the size of it. You don't have to read all of it. But one of the quotes that I love from this book, the aspirations of society focus not just on the rate of growth of the economy, but also on its direction and its quality. Those 2 words I love particularly, the direction and the quality of the GDP. Let's dive into each of these words and understand a bit more. What does the direction of the GDP mean? Well, is the economy creating goods and services that are beneficial to societal well-being? And I don't think we have to think too hard about all of the things we produce in our economy that are beneficial. Things like education, things like healthful food and agri-food products, things like quality healthcare. But we also don't have to think too hard about things we produce that arguably are not in societal's best interests. Things like weapons or guns, things like tobacco or illegal drugs. All of these things actually do get counted towards the GDP, but they're not moving us in the right direction in terms of societal well-being. So that's the first question we ask, is what we're producing in that GDP moving in the right direction? The second, the quality of the GDP. Is the economy creating opportunities shared equally by all? Now, in a world where growing income disparities and opportunity disparities, this has been ongoing long before COVID, probably for the better part of the last 30 or 40 years, we've been seeing around the world this gap of between haves and have-nots, or those with opportunity and those without. And I think COVID has sort of laid bare for us all in stark terms that, in fact, not everyone is being treated equally, or not everyone has the same opportunities. COVID has been far more punishing on low-income workers, on women, Indigenous workers, youth, racialized Canadians. So we have to, as we move out of COVID, and here in Alberta as well, we have to ask ourselves, is the quality of our economy, is it creating opportunities shared more equally by all? So I'll leave it at that. It's not just the rate of growth of the GDP or the size of the GDP we should concern ourselves with. We must look at the direction and the quality. Number two, in terms of economic truths to unlearn, we need to diversify Alberta's economy. We hear this all the time. In fact, I've probably said it myself, and I've looked back over the last, since I've graduated from university, the U of A, 1989, this is the 7th recession we've been in Alberta, 2020 being the last and the granddaddy of all recessions. But, every time a recession hits Alberta, which, we've seen 7 of them, every single time we wring our hands together and we furrow our brow and we say, gee, it would be great if we were more diversified. Shouldn't we diversify our economy so that we're not on these wild roller coaster swings all the time? But I would suggest it's not necessarily diversity that we're chasing in Alberta. Diversity, if you look at it, interesting paper from Calgary School of Public Policy, Dr. Trevor Toome, he did a research piece a couple of years back, and he concluded that really Alberta is no more or less diversified than any other province in Canada. The challenge is not our diversity. The challenge is our dominant industry, and every province has a dominant industry. But Alberta's dominant industry, the oil and gas sector, is subject to a lot of wild volatility. That's really the issue. It's not so much our lack of diversity, it's the fact that our dominant industry is so volatile. And when you look at the most economically diversified province in Canada, it's Manitoba. Now, no disrespect to Manitoba. I think it's a wonderful place. I know many wonderful people from Manitoba, but I don't know if Manitoba's economy is really what most of us have in mind when we think aspirationally in Alberta. So it's not just diversity, it's really more stability and dynamism that leads to prosperity. I'd say that is what should be our end goal. Now, it is true that more diversity could lead to greater stability, but I think it's an error saying we need to diversify Alberta's economy. That's not the end game. Stability and prosperity in a dynamic economy, that should be our end game. Economic truth to unlearn, number 3, growing the economy by lowering taxes. Back in the 20th century, this was the number one way, I would argue, that most economic development offices would try to attract businesses and individuals. It was all focused on who could offer the most attractive tax environment, which no doubt meant lowering tax. It was always this kind of race to the bottom. Who could offer the most tax incentives or the lowest overall rates of tax? That may have worked for a long time in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, I would argue that lowering tax rates is no longer the most important way of attracting businesses or individuals. It's a much more complicated world. I want to share 4 other factors that are at least as important and possibly more important than lowering taxes. Number 1, the reputation of the province or the region. What kind of messages are we sending to the rest of the country or to the rest of the world? And I think we really need to be paying attention to this in Alberta right now. Arguably, we sometimes have a bad reputation, maybe rightly or wrongly deserved. But if the values that we are conveying as a province or as a region are not in alignment with the values of businesses and individuals from outside our province, and that could be around the environment, it could be around social issues, it could be around equity issues. If those values are not in alignment, we shouldn't be surprised if, in fact, we are not successful in attracting new businesses or people to our region. So that's the first one. Number 2, pardon me, and I'm just going to take a swig of tea here. Number 2 is what I call the CARS sector, culture, art, recreation, and sports. This really has to do with the quality of life and the amenities that your region offers. This is especially true, we know, for young people. They don't want to move somewhere that the perception is there's nothing to do or it's kind of dead. They want to move somewhere where there's lots of things to do, and not just in the arts and culture. This picture here I'm using is the Art Gallery of Alberta in Edmonton. And I don't want to be Edmonton-centric or arts-centric. I could just as easily have put, Winsport Canada Olympic Park on there as well. It all has to do with, do we offer a lot of quality of life amenities to attract and retain people? Number 3, education. And this is not just K-12 and post-secondary education, although that remains very important. But increasingly, there is evidence to suggest that young families, for obvious reasons, they are really interested in early childhood education and quality daycare availability. Those two factors that could be the make or break if an individual or a family is looking at relocating or moving to the region. So we need to pay attention to that more than ever. And then finally, transportation systems. And I would include in this digital transportation. In other words, high-speed connectivity. Traditional manufacturing companies or industries, and we still have a lot of those in Alberta. Traditionally, they would look at that road and rail transportation, maybe pipeline transportation, and that remains important. But increasingly, it's air transportation and, as I said, digital transportation. And that digital piece of it might become even more important as we move through COVID, because everyone is understanding that they no longer need to be tethered to an office building, not in the same way. The ability to work remotely really does open up possibilities for people to say, my employer is in this region, but I actually want to live in that region, in that city. And I'm able to do that sometimes through connectivity. I mean, depending on the job and the role, but digital transportation, digital connectivity gives those individuals much greater latitude to decide where they want to live. So those are 4 factors I would say are extremely important in 2021 when we are looking at growing our economy, attracting businesses and attracting individuals. It's no longer just who can offer the lowest tax rate, although that does remain a piece of it for sure, but it is a much more complicated picture in 2021. Economic truth to unlearn, number 4. We need to balance the environment and the economy. Now, this one might be controversial, and some of you might be raising your eyebrows, especially if you know me, that I would be suggesting such a thing, that we don't need to balance the environment and the economy. And I want to be really clear, it's certainly not around environmental stewardship that I have a problem. Absolutely not. My problem with this truth is the word balance. This idea that we balance the environment and the economy. We hear people say that all the time, to the point where it's become this truism. But if you think about the word balance, in the world of physics, a balance means what is good for one side is necessarily negative for the other side. It is a zero-sum game where one wins and one loses. And I don't think we should be thinking about our environment and our economy in that sense, because that would imply whatever we do that's good for the environment is necessarily bad for the economy. And I think that's entirely backward thinking. Rather than balance the economy and the environment, I think we should think about harmonizing the economy and the environment. And I'm going to dip into a little bit of my childhood musical background in music theory. And those of you who know music theory and the theory of harmony and chords, you know that the 3 or 4 notes that would be played in a chord, one note does not take away from the other notes in the chord. In fact, one note augments and enhances those other notes in the chord. That's what harmony is all about. Even the physics of a piano key or a piano string being hit by the hammer, what those vibrations do in a harmony is in fact enhance the vibrations of those other notes. So I think this is the way we should be thinking about our environment and our economy, harmonizing. In fact, that they both can augment and enhance the other. And in my conclusion, I'll give you a couple examples of how in fact we are seeing this right now in Alberta. Economic truth number 5 to unlearn. Free trade is always beneficial. Now, this one, I have to confess, was really pounded into my head as an econ undergrad at the U of A in the late 1980s. Because some of you will remember at the late 80s, Canada, we were embroiled in this debate over free trade with the United States. And the 1988 federal election was basically a referendum on free trade. And as an econ undergrad, this was, really instilled in my head. Economic theory was clear that trade liberalization would enhance national economic output. There was no question about this at all. Now, 40 some years later, I'm taking a more nuanced look at this. Is free trade always beneficial? I would say that free trade is always beneficial for a national economy. But what we've learned is that it is certainly not beneficial to every individual in those national economies. And that is why in the 21st century, we are seeing a lot of resistance towards trade. It's often said that a rising tide lifts all boats, but that's only true if the boat is in good condition. If a boat is not in good condition or is compromised in some way, a rising tide is not going to lift that boat. It's going to submerge that boat. Now in 2021, Canada, we find ourselves, globally in a very awkward position with respect to global trade. Our two largest international trade partners, the United States and China, of course, are embroiled in a 2-decade-long trade dispute, which has intensified at certain points. And it goes back long before Donald Trump. Some of you will remember even Barack Obama. He was much more diplomatic, of course, about it, but he was always kind of hammering away at China for its unfair trade practices. Now, Donald Trump, of course, he had a very, a bombastic style to him. And he really intensified, and almost made sort of a mockery of the trade disputes between the two countries. Now, under the Biden administration, we'll have to see where these two countries go. But, Canada, we are awkwardly caught in the middle of this. What I would suggest this means is that going forward, we can no longer simply rely on expanding our global trade to grow our economy. That was the model for Alberta and for Canada for most of the last 75 years, I would say, since the end of the Second World War, basically. You just export more trade deals with the US, trade deals with Japan, the European Union, Chile, all these free trade deals we have, and we'll grow our economy. And that worked really well. But in the 21st century, because there is much greater resistance everywhere around these big trade deals, I don't think it's practical any longer to just assume that we can export our way to greater prosperity. Rather, I think what we need to do is perhaps turn more inward looking, more domestic markets, both here in Alberta and the rest of Canada. Are there domestic markets that perhaps we've overlooked, or maybe we have not tapped into as much because in some ways it was too easy and too lucrative just selling more to America or to China? So I want to be clear, I remain a free trade advocate. I believe we should be moving forward with trade deals. We always have to keep in mind the boats that are not being lifted and how do we mitigate against that. But I think moving forward, we probably have more opportunities trying to grow our economy by tapping internal domestic markets rather than global. So just to summarize those 5 truths to unlearn. It's not just the rate of growth, but it's the direction and quality of the GDP we should worry about. It's not just diversifying our economy, but stability and prosperity, dynamism. It's the reputation, the quality of life, and the transportation systems in our region. That's how you grow an economy, not necessarily just by lowering tax rates. We should think about harmonizing the economy and the environment rather than talking about balancing. And finally, growth more likely to come from domestic markets rather than assuming we can export our way to greater prosperity. So with that, I want to move into conclusion with my snapshot of where Alberta's economy is going to be in 2021 and going forward. We are expecting 4.1% GDP growth this year. Now, after I just made a big deal about saying it's not the rate of growth we should worry about, it's direction and quality, which is true. That said, we do actually see a little bit of a growth spurt this year. 4.1% in an average year for Alberta wouldn't be too bad. And in fact, if we do see 4.1%, it will be the fastest rate of growth in 7 years, after having come through the recession of 15 and 16, and then the recession of 2020. But we have to put this in context. Even if we do see 4.1%, that gets us roughly halfway out of the hole that was dug in the contraction of 2020. 8.2% this province contracted. So we've got a long way to go before we even get back to pre-COVID levels of economic activity. The COVID vaccinations, of course, continue. I think more Albertans are feeling maybe a little bit better about it. I remember a couple of months ago, January, February, I think a lot of Albertans, a lot of Canadians were feeling a bit demoralized by how slow this vaccination process seemed to be and why it was taking us so long here in Canada. I think we are sort of getting caught up. So the vaccinations continue, but the reopening of the economy will depend on that vaccination continuing. We do expect at some point in the second half of the year, probably after July or August, that we will gradually see the economy reopening. Unfortunately, it's not going to come one day when, wouldn't that be nice if we could arrive at a day this year where that's it, it's all over. Everything reopens, the masks go away, everything just returns to how it was. We're not going to see that, of course. The reopening is going to be a very gradual process that could take up to a year. In other words, I think we'll start to see the reopening sometime this summer or fall, but it could take us, into the middle of 2022 before everything, including the big sporting events and the big concerts and, the mass where a lot of people are together. It could take another year before everything reopens totally. We're not sure. The energy sector, for its part, is stable. So I've talked about the energy sector being our dominant industry in Alberta, subject to a lot of volatility. The good news is in 2021, we actually see some stability. Oil prices are actually really good right now. They're above where they were pre-COVID levels. But even with those higher oil prices, we don't expect a lot of growth in the energy sector. We do expect, now not universally, you'll always find exceptions, but we expect that oil and gas producers are going to be applying that greater revenue, that more cash flow, applying that to repairing balance sheets and paying off some debt, and also some merger and acquisition activity. And that, from an economist point of view, is good. The fact that debt is being paid down and companies are merging and acquiring others, this is going to put our energy sector in a much more efficient position. They'll be leaner and stronger and more able to withstand changes in the future. So that's good. But the challenge remains that without growth, especially employment growth, it is going to still leave a lot of unemployment in the energy sector. A lot of those jobs simply not coming back yet. However, we do see growth in other sectors, and four that I want to highlight particularly. The first, the technology and digital sector. Now, Alberta, we've always had a tech sector. It's not new, but we are early days compared to, comparable regions like Waterloo or Vancouver or Montreal or Austin, Texas. So we're early days, but we are moving in the right direction. 2020, in fact, was a record-setting year for venture capital invested in technology in Alberta. And we expect 2021 to be a repeat of that. So growth in that sector. Agriculture and agri-foods, I'm always a fan of talking about our farming industries in Alberta. I always say any self-respecting farmer will remind you that farming has been around a lot longer than, in fact, the energy industry as a base industry in this province. And we are continuing to see some very good results. Traditional agriculture, 70% of Alberta's farm cash receipts, that's made up of the big three. That's the wheat, the canola, the cattle. And that traditional agriculture, that 70% is for the most part stable. 2020 was actually a good year. But where I'm more excited about is the growth that we're seeing in that 30% farm cash receipts. Now we're talking about a much more diversified and in a lot of ways a higher margin and higher growth potential. Here we're talking about things like cannabis. We're talking about things like pulses and chickpeas and quinoa. We're talking about vegetables, notably potatoes. One of the things that happened in 2020 is that Alberta surpassed Prince Edward Island and is now Canada's largest potato producing region or province. And that is going to continue. And then you can springboard to talk about agri-foods, things like food and beverage processing, including frozen vegetables like French fries, and all of the craft breweries and all the distilleries we're seeing. This has been a real success story in Alberta, and I think it'll continue. Renewable energy. Now, I did talk about harmonizing the environment and the economy and how we are seeing this happen. And it's happening through a lot of the renewable energy programs we're seeing in Alberta. And, you know, sort of like the technology sector, renewable energy is not new, and we shouldn't be talking about it like it's new. The first wind farms in Canada went up in Alberta almost 30 years ago. Wind and solar have been around for a long time, and we're continuing to see more investments in that. But there's also some newer kinds of renewable energy, at least newer for Alberta, notably geothermal and hydrogen production. Now, both of these are really early days. There's a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement around them right now. You know, we have to wait and see, in fact, if these are going to be sort of game changers for Alberta or not. But I think there is a lot of potential for both geothermal and hydrogen. And then finally, clean energy technology, related a bit to harmonizing the environment and the economy. But clean energy technology, this is where we're talking about applying some really good ideas and good technology to address some of those challenges that we have in our traditional hydrocarbon industry, notably the carbon intensity of it. We are being looked at very critically by the rest of the world. And again, maybe fairly, maybe unfairly, but the clean energy technology, I think, has a lot of potential to move Alberta and move the needle on the reputation the province has. Notably, among clean energy technology is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We are world leaders in this technology. It's not brand new technology, but it hasn't always worked economically that well in the past. But I think we are now at the point, a tipping point, where in fact we are going to see more of this. The federal government in their budget a couple of weeks ago, a lot of money available to developing and investing in carbon capture and storage. And I think that is going to be a growth area. There are a couple of risks to our rosy forecast, however. One is the severity of this third wave we're in. And, you know, and this is really frustrating to talk about, because when I put this presentation together about a month and a half ago, we were coming off the second wave, you know, and I think everyone was anticipating the third wave was going to be less severe. Well, now here we are, you know, early May, and this third wave is in fact more severe, troublingly severe, and we don't know how this is going to go. We've seen the added restrictions from the Premier last week, you know, everyone, or earlier this week, I guess, everyone, of course, hoping that this is able to flatten or bend that curve, but we'll have to see where this goes. But if the severity of the third wave continues, that, of course, then pushes back the reopening of the economy, and that then reduces our growth forecast. And then also vaccination anxiety. And this is one that, you know, I am a bit troubled about. The latest survey numbers I've seen, you know, 16% of Albertans are not going to, they've decided they are not going to receive the vaccine. And then another 18% that are in, you know, questionable. They're not sure about it or not. And it's that not sure point, or that not sure group that I'm concerned about. And as they might hear stories in the news, you know, about a blood clot, and, you know, I think we're losing all relative sense of risk around the vaccines. But when these news stories come out, that 18% of, you know, people who are anxious about the safety of the vaccines, I'm worried about that number growing. And if that happens, I mean, absolutely, I respect anybody's personal decision to accept the vaccine or not. But the slower it takes us to achieve herd immunity, or the longer it takes us, the longer it's going to take to reopen. And then again, our growth forecast falls. So with those two risks in mind, overall, I remain pretty optimistic about 2021. I know it doesn't feel like it today on May 6th because we're in this third wave, but I do see better days ahead for the province in the second half of the year, and then getting into 2022, when finally, at some point, we do believe the entire pandemic will be behind us. Again, a gradual process, but greater prosperity into 2022. With that, I want to thank you for listening. I do want to take 15 seconds, a quick little plug for my new book, Spiders in COVID Space. This is a sequel to a book we released in 2017. Spiders in COVID Space really captures some great, inspiring, compelling stories of Alberta businesses and not-for-profits that in some unique way were able to pivot and reinvent themselves, or what they did during the pandemic. If you're interested in the book, by the way, it's a much quicker read than Mark Carney's 500-page book, just to let you know. But if you're interested in it, you can email me at the bottom, do an e-transfer of $15 and I'll drop one in the mail. Or you can visit my website, toddhirsch.com, and there's a few other options for purchase. With that, I will return to you. And Brad, do we still have some, I hope I haven't used up all my 45 minutes, if we still have some time for Q&A.
I think we do. Dimitra, I'll pass it over to you to moderate that. Is that correct?
Yeah, we for sure do.
Perfect.
That was excellent,
Awesome.
Todd. Thank you so much. And we do have some time for questions. There isn't anything in the chat just yet. So if anyone wants to pop something in, if they do have questions, feel free to. I just wanted to know, I really appreciated your perspective, Todd, on balancing the environment and the economy, and changing that to harmonizing those two issues, because I think it creates a lot more middle ground for people to have conversations around and to work towards a common goal. So I really appreciated that perspective, and as well your optimism towards the latter half of the year. It's been a slog for many of us, and so knowing that brighter days are ahead of us is reassuring, and can give us some motivation to get through this next little bit and get through this third wave.
Yeah. Dimitra, I was just going to add that, Todd, I appreciated how you put into context the 4.1% growth, but that we've got to make up, right? We've got to make up that 8.2 that we've, so really good perspective. Although I have to say, as a musician, my heart just swelled when you made the music analogy. So thank you for that. The rest was wonderful too, but that was great. So thanks, Todd.
You're very welcome. Glad it connected.
It did.
Excellent. So it doesn't appear there's any questions in the chat bot, so we can move forward. Oh, here's one from Robert Walker. He asks, how do we convince policymakers and City Council in particular that investments in infrastructure and transit in particular are essential? Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I met yesterday with I won't reveal which one, but one of somebody who's going to be running for council in the fall. And he and I got into this great topic of transportation and how important it is. I don't know how much more strongly people or economists can make the case. It seems to be one of these issues that you've dug your heels in either way. And making the case for it, if somebody's already made up their mind that they're against, the Green Line, or they're against the rapid transit bus line, or whatever it is, it seems like we're not going to change their mind. But maybe because of COVID, there might be a little bit more sensible minds around this now, because we've talked about how COVID has hurt disproportionately the most vulnerable in our society, the lowest income workers, workers that often have to use public transit as their only option to get around. And as we move out of COVID, maybe there's a stronger case we can be making that, public transit isn't just about spending money. It's about providing transportation options for everybody, but maybe particularly those who rely on it, the most vulnerable in our society, the lowest incomes in our economy. So there might be, you know, a COVID angle we can play as we try to think about post-COVID and how do we make the world and this city more equitable for everybody.
Excellent. Thanks, Todd. Another question from Jim. He asks, how will financial institutions and government manage demand for business owners who lost their businesses and want to get back in the game, and prospective business owners sensing a demand for small business services? It will be
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that, you know, personally, I have to say I've got some worry about it, because so far we actually have not yet seen levels of business insolvencies spiking yet. They've been trending higher, but the only reason they haven't spiked is because of government support programs. But we do also know that there seems to be a lot of kind of zombie businesses right now. They're only keeping the lights on and still in business because of these government supports. At some point, those government supports are going to end. We're not sure the timing of that. But when those government supports end, then do we see the spike in insolvencies? Or, you know, will the reopening of the economy come just in time and those businesses might hang on? You know, I'd like to remain optimistic for every business in Alberta, but the practical side of me knows there are going to be many business failures, and that's the reality of it. What can banks and financial institutions do? Well, I mean, banks and financial institutions, we do have a responsibility to our shareholders, and in the case of ATB Financial, that is U.S. taxpayers in the province of Alberta. We're a Crown corporation. We have to be responsible as lenders, and, you know, as much as we would like to just keep supporting small businesses that have clearly, you know, not managed to succeed, we can't always do that. What I think is going to happen is, as we move out of COVID, a lot of those business operators are going to have to reinvent themselves in a different way. And we talk about that in the book, Spiders in COVID Space. We make the point, businesses don't adapt, business owners adapt. And in some ways, that personal story of that business owner, that might mean winding down a business. Every business has a lifespan. And it might mean, and it's, you know, it comes with grief and it comes with sadness, but it might mean winding down that business that is no longer viable. But then as a business owner and entrepreneur, how do you reinvent yourself? What new ventures, new business opportunities might you engage in post-COVID? And I think that's what we're going to see. It's not just trying, as much as we'd like to, but it's not just trying to keep every existing business in operation. There is going to have to be an evolution, and that does mean many businesses are going to have to wind down. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thought I would be able to avoid it. So this will be our last question, just given the time, for Todd. So it's from Mike Rogan, and he asks, what are the implications for government budgets post-COVID? Are there economic truths about debt that we need to relearn?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question, and this should be another hour-long presentation. The implications of government debt. I think it's different for if you look at a federal government or a provincial government. I think a federal government does have more tools and more latitude in terms of, you know, working with central banks to expand money supply and allow inflation to rise a little bit. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but it's a tool a federal government has that a provincial government does not have. But if it's provincial, if it's federal, you know, every government around the world right now is looking at just this unforeseen pile of debt suddenly on their books. You know, I'm not panicked about it yet. We have seen debt to GDP rates higher than they are currently. In our generation, they were higher in the 1990s. I don't think we should be complacent about that. I think we should be concerned about it. But there are options moving forward to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. That is always what we should be looking at, not just the absolute level of debt.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Todd. This was really informative. I really appreciated you taking the time to share your expertise with us this morning and your fresh perspectives. Again, a little bit of optimism to carry us through this third wave for sure. I'll pass it over to Brad now so he can introduce Steve.
Thanks so much, Dimitra, and thanks again, Todd. Our next speaker is Steve Eichler. Steve is a partner and executive committee member at Field Law. He practices employment and administrative law with a particular focus on occupational health and safety defense and compliance issues and related criminal matters. In addition to his trial work, Steve advises businesses and corporations, both for-profit and non-for-profit, on matters involving governance, registration and admission, ethics, and other professional and regulatory law issues. And Steve, I'm just going to go off script a little bit and say, you know, Mount Royal and Field Law have a very good relationship, and I want you to know we really appreciate that. So, so thanks for being here, and really looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thanks so much for that, Brad. Thanks for that little shout out. We value the relationship. We have, you know, many individuals there. We've got many friends there. So thanks so much. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. That was a fascinating presentation by Todd. I liked his pictures. I have fewer pictures, but I particularly enjoyed the shot of Mark Twain. That's some stash that he has, and I find inspiration there. Well, this morning, we are going to share my screen. Tell me if you all have that. Dimitra, we're good with that, are we?
Yeah, all good.
Beautiful. Thanks, y'all. We're going to have a pointed discussion, which is, of course, a needle pun, on what the law says about vaccines. We're going to talk about some legislation. We are going to talk about case law, and we'll throw some pointers in there as well. I'm going to stop using needle puns. That one was not intentional. Let's start at the end, because I think that it would be of assistance for everyone to see what the big notions are, and then we'll backfill that. So first of all, I think the big overarching question is whether or not employers are going to be able to enforce mandatory vaccination policies. You'll see that even though we are in interesting and challenging, unique times, the history of how courts and arbitrators have handled these issues is going to suggest that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to have across-the-board support for mandatory vaccination policies. Now, we may have to think about it on a sector-by-sector, industry-by-industry analysis. In the past, as we'll see, healthcare sector has had more success in that making things mandatory. It is likely, follow up from that, if we can't force everybody, what happens if somebody does refuse? If we can have a more mandatory policy, can we terminate employment for refusal to vaccinate? Well, I'm going to suggest that it's likely that you cannot terminate employment for that. There are accommodation obligations that are going to be necessary to consider. There are ways, I think, that we'll be able to achieve that, but as far as just a strict termination for failure, or rather refusal to vaccinate, I'm going to suggest that's not likely. Can we put in policies to support vaccination? Absolutely. Be mindful that when you do so, you're going to want to know, or you're going to have to know, who's following up with that. So that, in fact, will make you a health information custodian. So we're going to talk a little bit about privacy, but recognize that going down that road brings in a whole host of implications for any organization. It also has to be, I'm going to suggest, the policy has to be reflective of the actual workplace. And lastly, we have to consider about what alternatives to vaccination might be expected. There are a number of overarching concerns, things to consider, different kinds of law. The different kinds of law, some of them are laid out here. Occupational health and safety, which is my law love. It's the kind of law that's closest to my heart. It is going to find itself, this question, in a tension between the duty to protect workers and the worker's right to refuse dangerous work, dangerous conditions, etc. And so this is really, as far as OHS is concerned, this is where that tension is going to find itself. Earlier, I had mentioned exceptions have to be considered. Generally speaking, Alberta businesses are going to have to figure out, are they a federal or provincial employer? meaning do they follow Canadian law? Do they follow Albertan law? They're going to have to think about human rights accommodations. And as we'll drill down, we'll see what that actually means. There may be something of a knee-jerk reaction thinking that someone has a human rights issue at play, and that means that they can sidestep any of the policies. Is there a union setting or non-union setting? So is there an application to a collective agreement that's going to be relevant? And similarly, is there a charter issue to be found? Overall, I'm going to say this is a complicated issue. Everyone, regardless of what side they're on about vaccination or mandatory vaccination, recognizes it's complicated. It's very much in flux. You'll see that I'll have a few cases. Courts are jam-packed these days, having to do Zoom or WebEx presentations, and I expect that we'll have more, well, I know we'll have more information as time goes on, of course, but we don't have a clear answer in law, and therefore communication, particularly in a workplace environment, communication is key. I think trying to convince people about how important vaccines are and how it helps everyone, as Todd was suggesting. Everyone understands the issue, and so education and communication, I think, are the key. Okay, let's go to law school. I'm going to talk about some vaccine-specific legislation. Is there really specific legislation talking about our situation now? Well, no. There's currently no legislation addressing the requirement of employees to be vaccinated. There is, there legislation in place for vaccination, be it COVID or not? Well, there's no legislation to make it mandatory, but there's a possibility. We do have legislation regarding vaccinations in general, but in terms of specifically COVID, of course not. We do have the programs in place, but that's voluntary. So in terms of looking to legislation for real clues, I'm going to suggest that the government has chosen to leave this to the employment world to try to figure out how to do these obligations for the most part. So employers really are on the front line, and therefore it's them that are going to face employee complaints and any litigation type things as we see it now. The Public Health Act, and of course I'm mindful that you're all going to get these slides, so I'm going to bombard you with some information here. I'm going to touch upon them knowing that you'll see this all later. Under the Public Health Act, there is a train of thought that if you walk through the various sections there, you can get to the point that the Lieutenant Governor Council, we're satisfied that an emergency exists, particularly in the case of a communicable disease, which of course is this, may order immunization of persons not immunized. So I'm going to suggest that in law, it is possible. This is a complicated issue, but the idea that we don't have anything in place to order the immunization of COVID now, but I'm going to suggest that there is a possibility of reliance on the Public Health Act to get us there. There are various kinds of immunization regulation. They don't really help us for this same central question, the idea that after vaccinations, the practitioners have to report to AHS. There are requirements for storage and handling, etc. They've been around for a long time. So there is something of a regulatory scheme in place that I think could be expanded to do this. I don't think that they're going to use that because it is a question that is so political, that is so fraught with issues that I don't think we're going to see that, but I'm going to continue to suggest that our legislation would allow it if we wanted it to. Of course, an example is immunization in school. We do have legislation like that. Any of us with kids know that your kids getting vaccinated is a regular occurrence. There is a schedule. I won't get into why we do it. I think you all know why. There's a public good argument, and we have, for the most part, moved past those issues. I say for the most part, recognize there's lots of folk who are not part of this. But again, we have seen this type of rollout that we are more or less comfortable with the issue. We may not want to adopt it. We may not want to embrace that vaccination in our own families, but we're comfortable with the issue that government in certain circumstances can call for immunization. We have taken steps with respect to vaccination and the law specific to COVID. So if you look here, as of April 21st, the Employment Standards Code was amended, requiring employers to give employees leave to get a COVID vaccine. Now, it is an attempt to be reasonable to both sides. It's part of now the other leaves section. And, you know, again, reasonable, the employee has to give the employer as much notice. When they know that they're going to get a shot, they should let the employer know. After the request, the employer initially gives 3 consecutive hour leave, and longer if in the opinion of the employer, which is interesting. So if the employer thinks, well, you know, you'll need longer to get that shot in 3 hours, so I'm going to give you a longer leave, well, the employer can do that. But again, it's up to the employer. That is to be without loss of pay or benefits. And of course, that's an incentive for people to go and get their shot, that they don't lose their pay. The employee can be asked by the employer to give proof of the entitlement. So the idea that you know, you have to give a reasonable proof that I'm taking this leave to go get my shot and for no other purpose, just to go fishing or play guitar, as Todd or Brad would have us do. A question that has been underlying all of our COVID considerations in the employment world is, do I need a doctor's note showing I have COVID, showing I have symptoms, so I have to isolate? And I think because of the packing of hospitals that is now a real concern for us, that was foreseen, that we don't want to pack doctors' offices with, you know, possibly sick people in waiting rooms as you wait for a medical certificate. So the answer is no. You don't have to give anything beyond that reasonable proof that you're taking the leave for a shot. Okay, with that kind of general overview, which suggests Public Health Act can let us go that way, and our government has taken steps to facilitate people getting shots. Let's talk about what I think is really the real interesting issues here. Let's talk about some legislation, because who among us doesn't like an early morning, or I suppose a mid-morning conversation about legislation? I know I do. I'm going to start with OHS and just remind everybody, well, a couple of things. One is that some of these are going to change in the fall as the OHS Act has been amended. But for now, we're going to talk about what's in place for now. So the purposes of occupational health and safety, of course, is keeping everyone safe. Now it is quite broad, psychological and social well-being, but at its essence, it's about preventing worksite accidents, and worksite is broadly considered. It would include classrooms and laboratories, anywhere a worker works is frankly the definition. So the notion of OHS is to really protect the health and safety of workers. So how do you go about doing that? Well, of course, like so many of these topics, that either Steve or Todd or myself, I'm sure we could take any one morsel and do a week-long seminar on this. But so in a nutshell, how do you go about fulfilling your OHS obligations as the employer? Well, you do hazard assessments to identify hazards. This virus is a hazard, biological hazard. And then there's a hierarchical approach to dealing with it. Well, first you're going to try to eliminate it. So does a vaccine eliminate it? Is that the start of the hierarchy? There's an argument there. But if you can't eliminate the hazard, then you do this hierarchical approach. If you can't do it, then you have to first use engineered controls. Boy, if you were in the plexiglass market, you know, a year and a bit ago, you're watching this from Tahiti or somewhere fabulous, no doubt. Plexiglass is an engineering control, but maybe a vaccine is an engineering control. It's literally engineered. You can't eliminate the hazard. You can't wipe out the virus, but you can protect yourself internally, as it were, from that. So arguably that's an engineering control. Your next hierarchical step would be administrative control. Does that include remote work? Right. So administrative control includes shift work. Yeah. Includes remote work. Cleaning is an administrative, hand hygiene, etc. And then lastly, if that doesn't work, well, of course, PPE. You know, and as an OHS law guy, I have really watched with interest how OHS moved from the discussion of OHS officers and OHS nerds like myself to now it's very mainstream. You know, to hear kids in the schoolyard talking about PPE, it just makes my heart warm. So those are the obligations when we talked about the tension. So here's the other side of the tension. Workers have a right to refuse dangerous work if they believe a dangerous condition exists at the work site or the work constitutes a danger. There's going to be some changes here in the fall that's going to change it to undue hazard. And we're going to have lots of discussion in courts, et cetera, what makes a hazard undue. But the general notion for our purposes today is that if a dangerous condition works, and the argument, of course, is going to be somebody doesn't have their shot, therefore it is a dangerous condition at work and I'm refusing it. You have an obligation, employer, to keep me safe. And so I am putting my flag on the field, as we say in the sports world, and I'm refusing work. When that happens, it's very clear that there can be no adverse steps taken against a worker who refuses to work because of a dangerous condition. So I'm just going to check that. Okay. So I beg your pardon. All right. Now, the language there is going to change from discriminatory action to disciplinary action to kind of get away from the human rights element. But the notion is an employer, once a worker has complained about this, there are steps to do. You have to investigate, you have to take steps, et cetera, et cetera. So if somebody refuses, it's a MISA, it's a whole deal. For anyone in a federal sector on the Canada Labor Code, it's essentially similar to Alberta, dangerous condition, you can refuse and retaliation is prohibited. So of course you can see in the OHS world that the obligation to keep people safe, hazard assessments alongside the right to refuse is going to be an issue. As I've not experienced a work refusal with respect to viruses, with respect to vaccines, but I certainly have with respect to masking. And there is a real drilling down on the specifics of the work site. You know, do you have to mask? What kind of distances? What kind of alternatives are in place? And it just may simply be, no, we've investigated, your refusal is not accepted, and then you can follow on as the law permits you. So there's a bit of a recap. Employers have have to take reasonable steps. There is a hierarchical approach. You know, arguably, you don't need a vaccine. Arguably, remote working might be just right. And people may say, well, I'm not comfortable with vaccine. Why can't I keep working from home? And depending on your workforce, your work situation, that might be right, particularly if that refusal is based on something like a human rights complaint, which we're talking about. Right now. Boy, it's almost like I put these slides together in order, hey? What a great little segue. So we're gonna do a real quick Human Rights 101. The general notion about human rights is that it's up to the complainant to demonstrate a prima facie, on its face discrimination. That comes from the Moore case from the Supremes. And they have to show that there is a characteristic that's protected, so an enumerated ground. That A, B, that they experienced that there was an adverse impact that they experienced, and that the two were linked. I'm going to suggest that here, we're likely to be seeing either physical disability, mental disability, and when I say here, I'm talking in the context of vaccinations, or on the grounds of religion. You know, the adverse impact, the result of refusal in the human rights context. Someone's going to say, well, I wasn't hired because I refused, because I'm not, you know, I can't, because of these enumerated grounds, take the vaccine. They didn't hire me, or they fired me, end of employment. Or they said, well, you don't have to be here, but we're not paying you. So there's a deduction in wages. So when such a thing happens, we're going to have to consider the defense, if you will, to the allegation of discrimination. Is having a vaccine a bona fide occupational requirement? and or was it reasonable in the circumstances? Quickly, our Alberta Human Rights Act with respect to employment practices is you can't refuse to employ or refuse to continue to employ or discriminate in any way based on various enumerated grounds. Interesting, I've left out religion, and I don't know why that is. Arguably family status, but I think religion is better placed there. According to the Act, if it's a bona fide occupational requirement, for example, flu season, a lot of people in senior care was an issue that the law was interested for a number of years. If you're a frontline worker, do you have to get the flu shot, particularly when there's a vulnerable population? Or if the contravention was reasonable, justifiable in the circumstances, are you able to argue those sorts of things? Are you going to say it's reasonable and justified for us to have a mandatory vaccine policy, or to insist on wearing PPE? The Canadian human rights is essentially the same thing. We have genetic characteristics which might be a tag along in these discussions for physical disability, and the exceptions are similar. I'm going to touch upon a case, being a law guy. This is a case that's getting some interest, and I think it is of assistance, and I wanted to discuss it with you. Even though it's not vaccine, it's about masks. I think the timing of these cases is such that we'll be focusing on masks. What's important about the case is that it really talks about drilling down and not just taking things at face value. In the Sharma case, it's a decision of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and it's with respect to a Toronto bylaw which required businesses to not allow people to come in without wearing masks. The applicant here, complainant, alleged that they were denied service at businesses because they did not wear a mask, and they claimed that the city discriminated against them because it impeded his breathing. Now, the reason it's an applicant is that they applied for this relief. The city came forward to dismiss the application, saying, look, there's no way this thing needs to go on to a trial. It's not going to work on the merits. When you look at the merits, there's nothing here to continue. So the tribunal found that there was a disability, and we don't need to get into that today. They found there was a disability. But then they went to take a look and say, well, is there a breach of the code? And they didn't just say disability, therefore you can't use the mask, therefore there's a problem. They actually drilled down, which is going to be one of the important messages, I think, coming out of my chat with you today. That they noticed that the bylaw talked about having to accommodate disabilities. Yes, you have to have this masking policy, but you have to have some off-ramps. You have to have accommodating disability, including exemption for medical reasons. Now, they noted that the applicant didn't bring the application against each of the businesses, but rather they attacked the bylaw of the city itself. And so the tribunal said, listen, the bylaw allowed for these to happen. You didn't go against the individual businesses. You came after the city. There's nothing wrong with the policy. It allowed these exemptions, and you can't just go after the city. So although they did open the door to a breach, they didn't go after go after the city itself, but it simply pointed out that really what Sharma should have done is gone after the individual businesses and see how their policies applied. So I put this forward to suggest that really it's a question of drilling down. Just because somebody makes an allegation that your policy is inappropriate, you really have to drill down to the specifics. And of course, to reverse engineer that, you have to drill down as you're making your policy to think about the individual applications of the policy. Moving on with human rights. Our Supreme Court some time ago considered what's a religious belief. A religious belief is where an individual demonstrates that they sincerely believe and have a sincere undertaking to connect with the divine as a reflection of their spiritual faith. And so, as I'm going to suggest here, just because somebody says, I have a religious belief, you are entitled, employers are entitled, and it's the obligation of the claimant to say that this is a validly held religious belief. In a very recent case, 2021, from British Columbia, Human Rights Tribunal. It is workers and district managers, because no one's named here. The reasons no one is named here is because this was a preliminary consideration of, do we even take this case? Again, it's a mask wearing case, but it's instructive because it really shows us the breaking down of thoughts, the breaking down of these issues. This fellow comes in and says, based on my religious creed, I can't wear a mask. A little tussle with the manager, you gotta wear a mask. I'm not wearing a mask. My religious creed, terminated. Brings the human rights, brings matter to the human rights. The Human Rights Tribunal considers what the Supreme Court of Canada would have them consider from the Absalom case. Do we have an experientially religious issue? Is there a sincerely held belief, etc.? And so when they explored these issues, you don't have to, just to be clear, you don't have to prove the existence of God or prove the existence of your God, or that your God wants you to wear a hat or not wear a hat or do this or do that. I can say that because I'm from a hat wearing background. The worker here describes his religious belief as basically a general notion of we're all made in the image of God and face covering is therefore inappropriate. And the tribunal said, look, we don't think that's religious belief. Like, that's not specific. And there was questioning and consideration. That's not good enough. And the complaint was rejected. And so the takeaway here, I think, is, as before, that human rights are real, of course. They're legitimate. We need to consider them. But we need to consider them. And it's not just any old notion, such as this fella here. So I think you're allowed to not just take, you're allowed in law not to take face value religious belief. You're allowed to explore these issues. Now, look, it might be in front of the tribunal, but you're allowed to explore these issues. I am aware, I'm interested in these things. I'm aware that a lot of denominations of organized religions have accepted vaccine. They've put out statements, some surprisingly a long time ago. And so these are difficult issues, but we need to consider the details. I would say that on physical disability, it's not just allergies. There are mental aspects to this too. Needle fear, some of the concerns about the vaccines themselves, they might be quite legitimate, but you are allowed to explore. Let's quickly touch on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, one of the many things that make this country great. This is, of course, is part 2. I know with the university crowd, y'all know this. Part 2 of the Constitution. A little note, I saw the Queen, and that should be PET, Prime Minister Trudeau Papa, sign it, because I lived in Ottawa, and I saw them drive by after they signed it, so I always feel a real connection to the Charter. You know what it's about, listing, among other things, individuals' rights and freedoms. Of course, it's not absolute, and I'm going to dwell here just on a little bit. It's not absolute because, like so many other of the pieces of legislation that we've seen, there have to be exemptions. There have to be balances. There has to be a reasonableness embedded into the legislation. And this is so fundamental that this is section 1 of the Charter, that any infringement has to be according to what's reasonable in a free and democratic society. And that comes from the Oakes test, from the case of the Queen and Oakes, RV Oakes, that talks about, if you're going to infringe on one of these rights, how do we make sure that that's okay? We feel okay with that infringement in a free and democratic society. And the general notion is that it's got to be a pressing and substantial purpose to whatever the government action is, such as ordering mandatory vaccination, to override a constitutional freedom. And that the way you do that to advance that legislation's objectives are reasonable and justifiably demonstrable. The list of freedoms that are going to probably be engaged is some that we've already seen: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, right to life, liberty, security of person, right of equality to the law, to the protection, benefit of law without discrimination. So some of these things we have seen in the human rights context, but we have this specifically with respect to the Charter. So as a general overview, if there is a law that is infringing something, then the Charter will apply to the law. If there is an infringement, will there be will that be saved? Now, if it's not a law, if it's just a policy, so it's not a government action, the charter probably won't apply. But sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes there are organizations that have charter elements to them. So anyone pursuant to the Post-Secondary Act, Post-Secondary Schools Act rather, might have charter elements to them if there's because they have state powers. Other participants might be state actors and use state powers, so they could be involved in the charter analysis as well. So depending on your situation, you may need to think about that. Now, with respect to privacy, which is, so we've talked about OHS, we've talked about human rights, we've talked about charter to the extent that that applies. And I think all of this supports the notion that this is complicated stuff. This is complicated stuff that we're struggling. There are a myriad, sometimes overarching, sometimes complementary, and sometimes standalone issues. I'm going to suggest one of the standalone issues with respect to vaccines is privacy legislation. The overarching notion of privacy is that it regulates the collection, the use, and the disclosure of personal information. In all privacy legislation, you'll find that tripartite subject matter. How do we regulate these three? You will also find the information that's collected to be broadly defined, whether it's employee personal information, it's all quite broadly defined. This is the privacy century. Well, it used to be until COVID, but until now, it's been the privacy century. And of course, there are different acts depending if you're public or private sector. If you're the federal sector, there's PIPEDA. If you are Alberta, there are two. If you're in the public, there's Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act, FOIP. Some spell it with 2 P's. I do not. I choose my freedom to spell it with only 1 P. If you are in the private sector, there's PIPA. It's also the acronym century, I guess. But there's also one that we need to consider, because if you are going to figure out, or if you were going to decide that you're going to keep track about who's been vaccinated, who's not been vaccinated, well, that's health information, and you're going to be subject to the Health Information Act, possibly. I'm going to say probably, but possibly. And so as a general notion, as you're thinking about how to make a policy for you and thoughts on you, personal information is very broadly defined. Health information is near sacred, jealously guarded. Generally speaking, an employer is not allowed to know about their employees, their workers' health situation. And this is why you have third party, this is why benefits providers are often at arm's length. This is why, employee assistance programs are at arm's length. If there's you get to know about accommodation, you get to know why, you don't get to know why I need that accommodation. This is not a novel thought. With respect to vaccine, it's going to be medical information. And so you are going to have to really think through how you're going to get those policies out, how you're going to do those collection, use, and disclosure issues. You're going to have to think about, why do I need this? If it's coworkers, well, then you have to think through, what information do I need for coworkers? Is it for customers or clients, or in your case, students, etc.? Why do I need this information? Why do I need to keep track of this? How am I going to collect this information? Are they going to tell me? Are we going to send out forms? Is it going to be an email? How am I going to set that up? How am I going to safeguard that information once I have it? I now have people's private health information. What kind of locking mechanisms do I have? Is it going to be physical? Is it going to be computer? How am I going to do that? So I'm going to suggest that the way to address this is to really have consultation and engagement with workers. And I say workers, but it really is going to be anybody with whom of whom you're collecting that information. In law, people need to know these things. There are consent elements, and really these should not be taken lightly. In the little bit I have left before, I hope we get into some really juicy questions. I'm really counting on y'all to make me think here. And I know you're going to get these, so I'm not going to dwell on them. I'm going to say that historic cases, there's lots of seniors, residents, nursing homes, hospitals, that sort of thing. Because they're historic, there's a lot of flu, some SARS, some MERS, which was a cousin of SARS, of course. The case law is inconsistent. Sometimes I find it quaint. I will touch on a couple of quotes or two. Looking at it now from our vantage point of May 2021, to see a case that talks about how uncomfortable wearing a mask is and how the employer can't dictate that to their employees, I find that quaint. I also find it quaint that they open the door to the notion that, well, the science is not determinative, and as such, to make a policy that is relying on a bedrock foundation of accepted science. Well, we don't have accepted science. We hear those arguments too. You will see the cases giving us thoughts on how to approach these things, trying to balance patient's care, and especially elderly patient care in those cases, versus worker privacy, which is very much alive for us now. And the cases give it something, I would say, a checklist of things that we should be considering as we proceed. From 2001, Care West is one of the cases we go to a lot, and it really set a kind of balancing that we need to think about. Flu vaccine policy, there was an outbreak, care facility for elderly. The policy did balance workers' right. There was no threat of job loss if not vaccinated. It did open the door to, medical, religious, so human rights charter type exemptions, and it was upheld. 2002. A similar type thing, not unreasonable, because it violates the right to refuse. Chinook Health, 2002, same sort of thing, gave employees a choice to take leave without pay, use vacation time, or use other methods, which is, again, all these are hints. More recently, in the last decade, we have vaccinate or mask policies, just with respect to flus. The Sioux Area Hospital Ontario Order of Nurses Association is an oft-cited case looking at that. And the arbitrator notes that the wearing of a mask for good reason may reasonably be expected of healthcare workers, but a balancing of interests is required. And wearing a mask for an entire shift is most unpleasant and found against the policy. Is that going to be upheld now? St. Michael's revisits the issue and points out that there's still, there's not clear consensus on the evidentiary, the expert evidence, that one day a flu vaccine might be developed that's close to 100% effective. Well, is that Pfizer? 95? Is that us? And then maybe we'll have to revisit this whole thing. And so you can see the case law is really taking us, I'll focus on some new things. The case law is really taking us to this position that, yes, balancing, that's been the historic view, but now let's balance it for 2020, 2021. And in this case, this Carasant, this is a recent case, I think it was the very end of 2020. It's about mandatory 2-week COVID testing policy, nasal swab testing. And the argument is, well, testing isn't cure, testing isn't prevention, testing isn't the panacea. And the arbitrator says, well, it's not like any of the drug testing or alcohol. It's not about that at all. And in terms of privacy breach, it still has to be balanced against the important public health considerations. COVID transmission and the long-term effect is something that we grapple with now. We're still studying, but we know it's brutal. And so there was an upholding of the policy. Lastly, I'm just going to point out that arbitrators are increasingly becoming hard on COVID issues where people are not following, workers are not following directions or not properly or honestly participating in screenings. So you have a couple of terminations being upheld by ignoring the direction to stay home and lying about the pre-screening test, puts their coworkers at work, and puts the public at risk, rather, puts their coworkers to risk. The same thing, this Garda case, that the notion that everybody now knows that you have to self-isolate, and if you don't do it, you're putting people at risk. And so I will end on the notion that lawsuits about this have begun. Of course, it started in the States. The first one I know about was from May 2020, had to do with a Walmart. The employer took steps to eradicate the issues, cleaning, etc. Things that are now obvious, but seem to be quite novel, a year plus ago. We have this in Canada now. Well, we have this in Canada. We had it, the first one I knew about in Canada was from a nursing care facility in Ontario. And there's one here in Calgary. The notion that a restaurant didn't take proper steps and people got sick. So we're now moving from these notions of should we do things to what happens if you fail to do things. So it's very interesting times. And I think I have some time left. I certainly hope so. And with that, I'll ask Dimitra to send me any questions that are up. Oh, thanks, Brad. You're on pause. You're on mute.
I was just going to say thanks so much, Steve. What a timely topic. Wow. And thanks for the guitar reference. I'm just going to put that in there too. I mean, so yeah, Dimitra, I'll turn it over to you because I think you've been getting some.
Yeah, I had lots of questions come to me directly as well. So I will try to get through as many as possible, just given the time too. So one of the first questions that we had was just around sort of the equity of responsibility between employers and employees. So Peter notes that the number of precautions that small businesses have had to take to shoulder, in addition to struggling to survive financially, including risk of shutdown, needing to keep employees and customers safe, and more. Even though employers are shouldering all of this responsibility, do they not have any right to require their employees to take on some of this responsibility to help keep their workplace safe?
You know, it's a great question. And so I will give you two answers, my lawyer's approach. One is, look, the law would say, absolutely, if you open the OHS Act, almost everything an employer has to do, a worker has to do. And recognize it says worker because it's not an employee. We don't care if you're an independent contractor. It's not about taxes. It's about people. That's why it says worker. It's about everybody who has some working connection to you. And almost every obligation of an employer is, let me stop sharing, is mirrored by obligations by workers. So I guess the short answer in law is yes, but the realistic answer is employers, including small businesses theoretically, have incentives, bonus, disincentives, writing you up, suspension, etc., to modify behavior with respect to safety. So, yes, on the books, workers have that obligation, but in reality, it's going to be the employer who's going to have the tools to put these in effect. They make the rules. So the burden is going to fall on employers, fairly or unfairly. I think theoretically fairly, in practicality unfairly, on employers.
Great, thanks, Steve. And the next couple of questions, I think, are maybe two sides of the same or different sides of the same coin. So somebody asks, the Alberta government website has left a disclaimer under the public health order that employees must work from home unless required in office for operational efficiencies. How much does this statement protect companies who actually prefer their workers to be in the office with all safety and distancing measures in place? And then I think the part B, maybe from an employee perspective, is wondering what legal recourse employees have if they're vaccinated but continue to work from home as per Alberta government work from home recommendations, even if the employer mandates that employees must return to work for operability. Although we are not essential and capable of work from home, for example, I'm working on a computer all day.
Right. Boy, this is the question of our time, and it's going to be the question of our time in the future. I see this issue, transmuting. There'll be a variant, of this question in the future, because now people think, well, fine, we're post-COVID. That was a quaint year or two that we had. It's now 2023. Why can't I continue to work from home? So this is going to be one of the questions of our times. Can you rely on a disclaimer on a government website? I would use it as one of the arrows in my quiver, and I would say, yes, it is arguably goes along the lines of officially, an official told me I can do that. The cop said I could park here. And, but the disclaimer on the government website, I wouldn't go that far. I would counsel, as I have throughout this morning, look at your specific situation. And I would think about the times we're in. If we are in a really bad period, as we are these weeks, we're closed down, do you need to have people there? Really? I would drill down and think about, fine, your essential services, but do you need people there, right? Can you not come up with an alternative? If you have to force the issue, then you have to force the issue and drill down. But the idea of, the idea of relying on a vague statement to as your primary legal shield, I think is problematic. I would prefer that you have a thought out, cohesive, exemption-based policy.
That's great, thank you. So some technical questions a little bit. So is there further guidance related to the vaccination legislation regarding if an employer already has flexible paid time off available for their employees to take and get a vaccination? Are they obligated to provide additional paid time off?
Like most of you, I have my employment standard code right here.
My nightstand, actually.
This section applies to employers and employees for the purpose of requiring employers to provide. So it doesn't carve out that legislation or that from the legislation. But I would say to people, we often see this. We often see these issues that the worker, they know what's going on. They know the situation we're in. And so I don't think it's wrong for an employer to say to a flexible hour employee, say, listen, I know that if you ask, I have to give you the 3 hours, but that's going to cost me. And I don't have that, because if I give it to you, again, I have to give it to you. That doesn't help the bottom line. So if I go under because I have to now give 3 hours that I really can't afford, because what's coming in, kind of, you know if our doors are open or not. So I'm just asking you, maybe if you can do this on your own time, that's fine. I don't think that is denying. It's essentially suggesting that they not make the request.
Mm-hmm.
If people don't make the request of me, it's not engaged.
Right.
I would have conversations.
Okay, one question here asks, do you have any recommendations for creating templates of vaccination policies?
Yeah. Todd finished. I don't write books, but I would say call me. I would say call me. And just because it's a request for recommendations for policies, I'm not so sure. Look, I don't like wills kits, drugstore purchased law answers, because they tend not to think about everything you should, and they tend not to focus on where you are, etc. I think these policies have to really be tailor-made. So you may have policies about something else in your workforce that could be a good starting point. And I'm happy to discuss this with anybody to kind of point you in the right direction. But offhand to say, go here. The government doesn't give you these policies templates. There's lots of great policies templates in OHS issues generally, but not this specifically for those reasons.
Perfect. And I think our last question, just based on time, is
make it a good one, Dimitri. Make it a good one.
It's this one that I have in front of me. I think it's pretty good. So it says, for small business owners who are financially fragile already, is the guidance to use their best informed judgment and wait to be wiped out by needing to defend themselves in courts to sort it out? If you do too much and get sued, or do you do too little to get sued? Can the government step in and do something to simplify this situation?
I would say yes, the government can do something to simplify the situation. But I take comfort in this. I take real comfort in this. There are reasonableness exceptions, an off-ramp called reasonableness in the Human Rights Act, in the OHS Act, less so in the Employment Standards Code, but we're only talking about the short window of leave. I think there is a recognition of the weight that businesses, and particularly small businesses, are carrying. That the notion of a frontline worker in the employment world, there's lots of frontline workers, and businesses are frontline workers, not just the actual individual human. Businesses are frontline workers. And so I'm going to say that depending on the situation, this is not legal advice. It's not carte blanche. Steve said, therefore, if your defense in court is that Eichler said, I don't know if you have a defense, but I think the notion is we have to be reasonable. You have to make best efforts on some things. You absolutely can't do it. If they ask you for 3 hours, you got to give them 3 hours. But on this notion of reasonable and trying to make this work and trying to move forward, I think, yes, things can be done. And I would talk with your workforce, particularly if it's a small business, particularly if your workforce is numerically, if it's a close number of people. We all get what's going on, and we all get that we're soldiers of one kind or another in the fight against this. And people understand, and they will make accommodation, because no one wants your business to go down. Certainly your workers don't.
That's great. That's excellent. I think that's a perfect note to end this on, because it talks about sort of, the reasonable expectations that we can all have of each other and try to support each other through these things. So thank you so much, Steve, for your time this morning. I have to say, on a personal note, I really appreciate all of the puns. It's definitely my humor. So that was great. And it's a super timely issue, and I think that was sort of demonstrated in all the questions that we received. So I'll hand it over to Brad to introduce our final speaker. Thank you again, Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dimitra, and thanks again, Steve. And I'll just echo Dimitra. I just found it to be such an accessible, important topic, very accessible presentation. So thank you, Dimitra. I knew you'd love the puns. I was thinking of, so that's great. So thanks again, Steve.
Thank you.
Our third speaker today on our panel is Stephen Armstrong. Stephen is an author, speaker, and leadership expert. From the Arctic to European countryside, from Asia to Africa, Steve Armstrong has seen and done it all as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Red Cross. Now, these days, he uses his skills that he learned while leading complex strategic situations around the world to help others achieve their leadership goals and create long-lasting positive results. And Steve, I also just wanted to say on a personal and professional, thanks for bringing us all together today for this really important discussion, for your leadership in bringing us here together. So with that, sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brad. So what I'd like to do is start with a story, because that's my business these days. And so my story is this, that what we have to do as leaders is not to waste this opportunity. And we need to figure out how we're going to move forward. So I would suggest my story is this, as a past member of the Canadian Armed Forces, is that if you need to consider the worst possible camping trip you were ever on, imagine a time when it had rained for about a week and a half and you were wet and cold and miserable with wet and cold boots. And the only time it was hot out and sunny out was when you're actually working, and cold food, cold sleeping bags, cold everything. But on these operations, as a soldier, when we were doing this, we were extremely fit, well prepared, well trained, and we were ready to take on the world, to be perfectly honest. And but what happens is we move forward to the operation, and we travel across terrible countryside, swamps and rocks, because the Army doesn't like flat, easy ground to walk on. The Army likes hard stuff. And then we get to the objective. And we've rehearsed generally on an objective several times before we get there. So everybody knows exactly what to do when you get there. And you put in the attack or do whatever you're supposed to do when you're on the objective. But that's not even the most dangerous time yet. The dangerous time is when you're coming back. when you're returning from the objective. And I will tell you that almost to a individual time that when something has gone wrong on an army operation, an infantry operation in Afghanistan and Bosnia, or a training operation at home, it's when you're coming back, you've rehearsed, you drilled, you trained, you did your job, and now everybody has let their guard down. Everybody gets a bit sloppy and a little bit careless, and you're thinking about a nice warm dinner at home, not about the task at hand. And that is for everyone to get back home safely. Most accidents and most casualty counts in combat happen in the last couple of weeks of a person's deployment because they're thinking about being comfortable on their couch, laying in their underwear, eating potato chips and ordering pizza, not on what they're doing in front of them. And I would argue that at this particular moment, this is where we're at in COVID. We are on the trip home. Yes, it's tough right now in Alberta, I get that. And yes, the counts have gone up higher, but the back, as Todd and Steve have both mentioned, that the vaccine counts have come up. We're getting a handle on how to do this. If we're doing it at all, we know what to do. We know what the right answer is. So we need to drive through, and this is when bad things happen. So if you're a business person or a leader, this is when you need to be hyper alert. So my clients run from the not-for-profit to associations and corporations downtown, engineering firms and the like. And this is what I'm hearing and seeing from the people I'm talking to, that some people are failing. I think Todd mentioned it earlier. Like there are zombie businesses out there that are just being held together by duct tape and government grants. And they arguably, I don't want to wish anybody any ill, but they probably could have closed down some time ago. Most people are completely, utterly swamped. HR issues, reorganization issues. Some people are swamped because their business has exploded because of the business opportunity that may have come with COVID. Most are really fearful of their work. They're fearful that their work may end, they may lose their job or their business, but they're also fearful about what this means. Like in the fall, I have a friend who worked for a giant oil company, oil pipeline company downtown, and his boss wanted everyone back in the office because that person, and there's lots of people like this out there, drive their sense of ownership and power and influence by looking out from the corner office across the floor at all the little heads and oh, look, they're all my people. There's my budget. And there's lots of people out there. So, they were actually almost putting people in an untenuous situation because they were thinking that they needed to have these people in the office around them. And when people are working from home and working in a different manner, in a different style, a lot of poor bosses, to be perfectly honest, are threatened by that. So they're going to be in a tenuous situation. Most have not come to terms with the changing culture of work. So if you hired somebody new pre-COVID, so in 2019, somebody comes in the office and they get their desk and they get their stapler, and then you find the washroom and they find the coffee maker. And over a period of time between formal orientation settings, but more importantly, through informal watching what's happening in your organization, these people are going to pick up the culture. Is everybody in at their desk right at 9 o'clock? Can we go for coffee or a personal break whenever we want? Whatever it might be, people will be picking up that informal culture. But it's very difficult to pick up how the company works, the culture of the organization, the health of the organization, when all you're seeing is individual Zoom pictures of people's faces. And you might not even have very many conversations anymore with your boss, those casual bump-in conversations. So how do we build an organization that's A, healthy, and B, successful because of this place we're in and this coming through a traumatic event through to something new? I would argue that most people have not taken this opportunity to particularly change how they do business. And that's sort of where I'd like to spend some time here this morning with you folks, to build upon the reality that Todd laid out for us on the economics, and then the practicality and of the legal responsibilities of being a boss. And I would like to talk about being an exceedingly human leader in a time when it's super challenging. So quite frankly, in this world, I've never yet met an organization that was too stupid to succeed. And I've been involved with the Army, so that says a lot right there. Most organizations are full of super smart people and have technically brilliant people. But I have seen organizations that are far too dysfunctional to succeed and be successful. And this is where we're at right now. How do we do this? Well, we need to invest more time and energy than you'd ever imagine, so especially right now, because we're missing that informal conversation, that piece that brings us together about building cohesive teams that trust each other and are accountable to each other. And we need to spend way more time communicating clarity, being clear about our communications, but also communicating clarity. And I recently had a conversation with a leader of an organization, and the comment that ended up was, these people are not doing things properly, or whatever that situation was. And I said, when was the last time you talked to them about their work and the expectations? He said, I sent out an email months ago. Well, that doesn't cut it. And the last part of this conversation, hopefully we'll spend some time talking about what culture looks like and how do you reinforce it so that no matter what the workplace looks like in the future, be it virtual, in-person, or likely a blended version of that how do you build that culture so people are strong and healthy? So to build a cohesive team, we need to stop here and think about trust and vulnerability. And there's no shame in a leader talking to their people about the issues they're facing as a human being within this COVID response. In fact, I would encourage, if you're a manager or a director or regardless, a leader of some sort within your organization, I really do think that you should spend some time explaining to people what's going on and being a bit vulnerable about that so they can see that you're struggling too. Now, there's a fine line here. I come, because of my background and probably my character and also probably my generation, and that is that oversharing information is not my strength. And so I would, you need to be comfortable with this. But if your people know that you're struggling with Zoom and you're struggling with too many emails and the like, then I think that that's a fair game. And I think you should engage in a conversation with your people about how are they actually surviving? Like right now, do you have any, particularly ladies, moms, on your team who are completely stressed out about their kids being sent back home? Do they have enough technology in their house so they can survive? In fact, I don't know if people in Calgary heard it this morning. There was a conversation about moms with two moms this morning on CBC. And in the background, I don't know which mom it was, it sounded like there was a daycare riot happening in the background. So imagine that poor lady try to work for you while this was happening behind her. We need to stop figuring out how to be efficient. So this is not a keystroke count. This is about how to become effective. And those are two entirely different words. And I believe that we need to invest more energy in learning how to become effective. And that generally means to be persistently checking in with your team members. So we have Zoom calls or WebEx or team calls and stuff like that, and Slack or whatever it might be. And we use that as a communication tool, but that's not checking in. I would argue that you should actually be picking up the phone and talking to your people, if you have a team that you can manage, at least once a day or once every second day, and without a particular agenda, except to say, how are you doing? What are you working on? And how can I help? Where do you need help? And if anybody's been in a relationship, especially us thick-headed men, when we ask somebody how they're doing and they say fine, that's a danger sign. So we need to explore and gently probe into that so we understand what's going on with our people. And this is exactly the time I would say that we need to slow down so we can go fast. We need to pause, take more time. If you have a meeting lined up for today and there's 8 things on the agenda, take 7 of them off. You should have a shorter meetings, maybe more often, but shorter meetings with 1 or maybe 2 subjects that need to be resolved, and spend that time on that meeting on those subjects until they're resolved, and then take a break and then pick up on the next thing. And by going slow, I would say that you encourage people to slow down for you. Even simple things. Here's just something that was a pre-COVID thing. So I'm an early morning riser. I'm often up at, by 5 o'clock in the morning. I do my run and then I go to work. And even when I had a job, when I worked for a real company, I would actually do a lot of work in the morning before I would get to the office, because I knew that as soon as I hit the office and people started showing up, my ability to actually do work, do the task I needed to do were nigh on impossible. I had to become a leader and deal with a lot of human issues. And at one point, one of my employees said, "Geez, you work so hard. I see your emails at 5 in the morning." And what the person didn't realize is I went home at 4 o'clock but by 4, usually I was out of the office and on my way home. But what I had done was create an expectation that I was always working and I was always on. And I actually had to retrain myself to either time my emails to be sent, like put it on a delayed send at a specific time, or save them as drafts and then send them when I got to work, just so I didn't create this environment where people felt they had the obligation to keep up with my work pace, their perception of my work pace, not my actual work pace. So I think it's important for us to slow down a little bit and have these conversations. I think Steve did a great job of talking about, yes, there's the legal obligations for you as an employer and a supervisor to do these things for people, but why not have the conversation as a group and see how you're going to solve it together? Put it on the table. Bring your people together over a lunch break and order some pizza or whatever it might be, and put them around a table and say, okay, so, we need to get you guys vaccinated, and I encourage you all to be vaccinated, but we have this obligation to give you some time off. But how can we manage this in a way that's respectful to everybody, including the company and myself as a supervisor? And then what I would encourage you to do is not start with the first person that put their hand up, but go to the quiet people in the room and ask them what they think, or even do a whiteboard exercise with Post-it notes. And by doing these things, you will be able to engage people in solving your problems and helping you figure this out. So it's funny that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, likely, when the Muppet Show first came out, that they had the first animated Zoom call, as best I can figure. And this is where the clarity comes from. As a leader of people for most of my life and most of my career, what I found was that one of 2 things happened. One was if I stated, somebody come and asked me what I thought or asked me for my opinion, and I mentioned that I think this, and this about that. Somebody walked away thinking that was like commandments 11 through 50 and that were carved in granite, and ran off to do it because Steve said. Well, that has nothing to do with what I said. I just gave a share. The other thing that happens is that people don't really listen to what's going on that much, and they need to be able to be constantly communicated. So I'm a very blunt writer. Normally, I write short, terse emails. I often surmise my thoughts in a sentence or 2, but what's missing in there is context. So I've had to learn to slow down and talk to people more about what was happening. And I have to get them to be engaged with me. So by making a statement and watching the room or watching the Zoom call, I'm able to see when somebody is looking at me odd or weird and don't quite understand what I've said. And the worst thing that you can do is let people go off and assume that you said something that you didn't really say. So build upon your communications plan in a multitude of ways. Of course, use Zoom or whatever video conferencing or video tools you have to your best advantage. Double down by writing a thoughtful email about it. If you have a communications team, get them to proof it for you so that the message that you're trying to send is clear, because what you think in your head and what comes out on paper is not necessarily the same thing. Invest in more phone calls, or at least one-on-one Zoom calls, so that you can have a conversation and people faces don't disappear into a blur of Muppet puppets on a screen, and you cannot keep up with that conversation. In a different environment, I would tell people to sit with me in the meeting and watch who is blanking out or whose eyes are rolling or whatever's going on, and allow me to address that. So I think this is so challenging for us to communicate in a respectful and a thoughtful and an effective way. It's super efficient, but not effective at all. And if you think that you need to say it 3 times, then you're wrong. You need to say it 9 times. Every day you need to repeat it, whatever it is. If it's important enough that people need to be safe and sound, or your organization or your company's survival relies on it, you cannot say it enough. So you need to become the chief reminding officer of your organization, the CRO. And here's 6 questions that you need to ask, and you need to have this conversation with your team regularly. So why do we exist? And the first answer I get from a lot of organizations is that to drive profit. Well, that's an imperative. That's not a fundamental existential reason why you exist. Why does your organization exist? My little tiny company of me is here to make lives better by building better leaders. So how do we ensure that people yes, I need to make money. Yes, we like to have a good life, but that's not much for people that hang their hats on, especially when they're at the lower end of the social economic scale or at the bottom end of the pay schedule. They are not going to buy into that. So you need to build this existential question about why do we exist as an organization or a team within an organization? And how do we behave? I think this is the part that I would say that most organizations are struggling with right now, because how they used to behave before COVID, so in 2019, was one thing. And arguably a lot of that was unhealthy, just a point of observation, but you could get by. But most organizations haven't come to terms with how they behave now. What kind of culture, what are their values that they're going through? And making it hard for employees to do their job. I know a senior project manager with a company here in town working on one of the biggest construction projects in town, and their company has a keystroke monitor installed on all their computers. This guy is responsible for a project. I would expect it to be a several $million-dollar project, probably tens of $million-dollar project, to be honest. And somebody's monitoring him touching the keyboard of his desk. Now, how inspired is he going to go to work? On the clarity part, it's like, what do we do? And that ties back to that, or why do we exist? But what do we do to get there, right? And how do we succeed? Everybody needs to understand that the goal of the organization is how will we succeed? So if we look back 6 months from now, have we hit this target? And the next one is like, what is the most important thing right now? So I would encourage after this call, after this session this morning and today, is this afternoon or tomorrow, is to call your team together, your leadership, if you're a part of a leadership team, or you're a leader of a leadership team, or you're just working on a team. Ask everybody what the most important thing everybody needs to be working on right now to achieve success with the organization. I think you'd be surprised that you would not get a consistent answer. And that causes a divergence of thought, a divergence of action, and takes away from building trust and accountability amongst the team. And the last part is, pardon me, the last piece to speak about is that who does what. And this is the accountability thing. Like, are people being held accountable on your teams? Sorry, I'm just looking for my water. Are the members of your team holding each other to account in a respectful way? Like, you said you would do this and you didn't. You behaved this way in the meeting and that was disrespectful. These are hard things. But we as leaders really need to invest in energizing our people along that way. So what does it look like even in July now, or November, or next year, or as the decade unfolds? I think it'll be a very interesting place. And I think people, I hate the concept of old school leadership, because good, thoughtful, effective leadership has existed for millennia. Like Caesar and Attila the Hun could not have controlled the vast empires they did unless they implemented really excellent leadership skills. Now, to be fair, maybe the punishment for failure was a little extreme, but they still had to bring people along. And we as leaders, we gripe about our employees not taking ownership in what they do, but every day we spend time robbing employees of their ownership. For example, keystroke monitors, arguing over an hour or two here and there for COVID vaccination. Like, if people really, so here's a little story. It's when I was working, I had one of my senior managers come to me. At the time, the organization was in a little bit of financial straits. And she came to me and she said, well, you know, I got kids at home. I'd like to only work 4 days a week. And I said, absolutely not. I said, she wanted to take her pay down to 0.8 or 4 days a week. And I said, absolutely not, because I know you're going to go, even if you work from home those days, you're still going to work that day and you're still going to do all of the things that you think you need to get done. And it's only fair and responsible that we pay you for it. So I just think that we need to be really thoughtful about how we're making sure that, yes, we want ownership, but how do we make sure that we're always reinforcing that with the organization? So what's working well right now? Lots of us are doing a great job. A lot of you folks are leading teams on your organization. That's working well. So let's amplify that. Let's double down on those tools that we've put in place through COVID so that we can rebuild the organization. And we spent some time already talking about this, but how do we increase ownership, accountability, and responsibility with our employees? And number one way is by demonstrating that and living up to it as a leader. And if things aren't working well, let's bring our employees together, our team members together, and figure out how we can redesign it in a way that it works. And finally, we need to be able to measure it. So how do we know that we will be successful? You know, it could partly be a monetary thing, like we maintain this current book of business, or our current profit margins are still good. But it also might be that our team, we can keep most of our team together over the next year, and we can still perform at a high level. We need to know where to invest our time with this. What we need right now are leaders that are willing to trade current comfort for future success. And by saying that, this means you have to start having hard conversations with people around you about accountability, about responsibility, about what they're doing, how they're doing it. But I also think we need to have hard conversations by bringing our teams together in a way that we can have this conversation about accountability and responsibility and ownership, that we hold each other to account and we work on. We need to learn how to run better meetings, especially in a Zoom or a video or virtual environment. We need to be able to understand that these meetings are complex and challenging, and that we need to figure out how to engage people so that we hear what they're saying and understand what they're saying and understand what they're facing as human beings and as employees and contributors, so that we can move forward. And the last piece about investing your time is, more than ever, we need to be spending time investing in the leaders of our teams and the leadership potential of our teams, because this is hard work. It's relatively easy to manage people in a building, but it's really hard to lead them when you don't understand what's going on in their lives. We can't keep our head down. This is exactly the time, like I mentioned in the story earlier about patrolling and moving in. When you're moving into enemy territory or facing extreme danger, your head is up. I'm going to tell you something. Your head is up. Your heart rate is up. You're hyper alert. But what happens when you achieve your objective is your head moves forward. It's a very human thing. Your mind moves forward into the future about being comfortable and relaxed on your couch or wherever it is. So now is our time to lift up our heads and look around, because we might have to drag people along because they're exhausted and tired. We might have to walk behind them because they need this push forward. They need being propelled, and they need to understand. Or we might have to walk beside them just to keep them company as we move forward on this journey. But whatever it is, we cannot see that if we're hunkered down, staring down, dealing with the busy work in front of us, the forms, the reports, the returns. Now's the time to get your head up and looking around and seeing what's going on and making sure people are with us. As Brene Brown, we need to have a spine of steel, says we need a spine of steel, but a soft front. So we need to be able to approach hard truths in our organization with humility and kindness. And that might very well mean letting people go. If they're not the right people, if they're poisonous to the culture, we cannot at this time, I believe, afford to excuse bad behavior. We need to be thoughtful, kind, and generous about dealing with people, but we also need to look after our team so that they can focus. His name, Alan Mulally, was the previous CEO of Ford, and when people on a senior executive team were not behaving the way the organization and the culture of the leadership team agreed that they would do, he would go to their office and he would say, look, Steve, I saw that you're not being accountable for the team. And that's okay if that's the way you want to be it. And the executive would go, oh, really? Well, thanks, Alan. And he said, yeah, no, you can do that. And I'm okay with it, but you can't do it here. So he would move these people out to ensure that leaders were being accountable, responsible, and of ownership. And again, as I mentioned earlier, now is the time for you to spend way more time than you ever thought needed or possible on reminding people about the core tenets of what they're doing, what the expectations are, and how you're getting things done. My last piece to tie into this is this. So in the early 1900s, there was a race to discover the South, or not discover, but get to the South Pole. And there was a Norwegian team led by Amundsen and a British team led by Admiral Scott. And they had two completely different approaches. They basically, I think it was more coincidence, but they started at around the same time. And the race was which nation would be the first to discover the South Pole. Scott drove his team hard. They went as far and fast as they could every day. And what would happen was they would cover sometimes 40, 45 miles in a 24-hour period. But eventually they just exhausted themselves. And when big storms came and food started running out, and it was really tough, and they were wearing themselves down and down and down. Amundsen made a deal with his troops, his people, to say that we will only do 15 miles a day, regardless. And he was so driven by this goal of 15 miles a day. So they would do 50 miles, they stopped at camp, they'd brew up tea, they'd have a good sleep. And if there was bad weather, they would hunker down. They wouldn't drive through the terrible weather that could happen to them. And when they arrived at the South Pole, they thought they were in second place. And they turned and they headed back to the sea, to the coast, to get on their ship to go home. And again, they did 15 miles a day. Interesting piece, the interesting fact of this is that the Scott team that was driving hard, pushing hard, doing the most they could do each and every day, actually ended up at the South Pole, if you can imagine, 35 days later than the Scott or the Amundsen team. And then, of course, the tragedy was on the way out that they started losing people as they were going out. And the last of the Scott team died in a tent with 100 miles left to go. So they just killed themselves. I would caution us today as leaders, as human beings, as managers, to make sure we're not killing our people in search of success that's elusive and potentially challenging. And so I'll leave it at that. I think we may have some questions, Dimitra. I am going to change my camera scene, so hopefully you can see me there.
There you are.
And yeah,
cool. Thank you so much, Steve. That was excellent. I think actually it was a really good anchor for the presentations today, because you hit on a few of the pieces that we've already discussed with both Todd and Steve. So I'll get to some questions that we have. Okay, so let me just see. There's a couple that are already in the chat box here. So one of the questions that came up is around productivity, and is there ways or is there tools that managers can use to ensure that work is getting done while people are working remotely? And I think you touched a little bit on it in terms of culture, but I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, well, there are tools. Like I told the story of the key count counter. I've heard that story from different people in different organizations. Quite frankly, I think if you are relying on those kind of technical tools to monitor and make sure things are getting done, you have a dysfunctional organization. So what I would suggest to anybody, no matter what culture or environment you're working in pre-COVID or now or in the future, is what you need to be able to understand and get your people to understand is what do you need done, and when do you need it done, and what do they need to do it, and have a conversation, almost a negotiation. And if you come back to them in a month from now and the work's not done, that is not their fault. I'm a hard-nosed boss. When I say that, that is your fault as a boss, because you did not check in with them on regular times to see how they're doing and are they meeting their objectives. I think that we need to invest, I've mentioned it several times in my presentation, we need to invest way more time in individually talking to our people. Are they on track? And if their objective is, I don't know what, say you're a booker for COVID vaccinations, and if they have to do 15 or 40 calls a day to appointments to book 40 calls a day, then, and if they're only doing 35, then you need to go back to them and have that conversation about why aren't they hitting their targets? What do they need? It could be a technological issue. It could be maybe they're just not geared for it. Maybe they need extra support. I don't know. But this is the monitoring, not electronic monitoring like a bracelet, anklet, like the prisons. This is like you need to be involved with your people.
That's great. And I appreciate too your comments around checking in more frequently now. Again, working remotely, I know what we've done, implemented some practices at our work where, everyone has this sort of notion of Zoom fatigue and another meeting online, but it makes such a difference just to pop in to a meeting that you don't normally attend, or chat with someone that you normally see. And just like you said, ask, how are you doing? What are you working on? And how can I help? So excellent advice, especially in these times. And I also appreciate the part about going slow to get there fast. I think, at the beginning days of COVID, a lot of people, ourselves included, were, it was just really reactionary and work and try to get things solved. But now I think there's a little bit more time to plan a little bit better and look ahead. Yeah. Unless
somebody's life is dependent on it, there's no need to rush. Take a minute, take a breath, and harness the energy around the intellectual horsepower around you. People are smart if we ask them to be smart.
Absolutely. Let me see. There's no other questions in the chat specific to Steve's presentation. Some comments about working from home, and again, I think it also echoes Todd's comments earlier about the impacts of COVID on women, BIPOC, those kinds of populations that are sort of carrying a brunt of that impact. So I guess what I can do is thank you, Steve, for your presentation, and like Brad mentioned earlier, thank you especially for bringing this whole crew together. It was a really, really wonderful morning. And we do have some time for some panel questions if anyone wanted to pop something in for the panel if you guys have a few more minutes to take them as a group. I'm happy to take some questions if there's anything from the group that anyone had questions from the participants. Maybe not. Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it.
We've answered everybody's questions.
I think so, and I think, like I said, I think it was really great perspectives and 3 very unique topics, but all woven together quite expertly and connected to the work that everyone's doing in terms of leading through COVID and trying to manage workplaces in this really new kind of reality that we're all dealing with. So thank you all again for your participation this morning. Steve, did you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
Oh, I thought I cut you off. Sorry. Excellent. Well, then I guess we'll leave it there. To the participants, thank you for your time and for attending this morning. I appreciate all of your questions and your participation. Like Steve mentioned at the outset, there will be a follow-up email that we'll send to all participants. And I see chat is blowing up now with a bunch of thank yous for our esteemed guests. So thank you all so much. And again, thank you, Todd, Steve, and Steve. Thanks to Brad as well. And thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was a great morning.
Take care all.
Okay, Steve. I'm going to sign off, my friend.
Take care. Thanks so much for this, Steve. Take care.
Oh my gosh, no pleasure. My pleasure.
Take care. See ya.